Where are you?
Tonight, I'm bringing you 5 terrifying tales that you won't soon forget. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to my channel, or I might just have to come find you myself. Now, let's get into the stories. It was a quiet April evening in 2001, and I was settled comfortably on the couch, engrossed in some mindless TV show. The day had been uneventful, just the way I liked it. But as the evening deepened into night, the tranquility of my home was shattered by an unexpected noise, a loud bang against the back door. Startled, I paused the show, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. A raccoon, maybe? Or perhaps just the wind playing tricks. I turned back to the TV, trying to brush off the unease creeping up my spine. But before I could fully settle, I heard it, a whisper, so soft, yet so clear. "I'm coming for you." I froze. The voice was so close, as if someone had leaned in right next to my ear. I spun around, but the room was empty. A chill of fear gripped me, and I called out, "Who's there?" But the only response was silence. Determined to shake off the rising panic, I grabbed the closest thing I could find for protection, a kitchen knife, and slowly edged towards the back door. I flicked on the light, and that's when I saw him. A man stood there motionless, wearing a white rabbit mask that covered his entire face. In his hand, he held a knife, gleaming and sharp. My heart leaped into my throat. I gripped my knife tighter, ready to defend myself. But then, in a sudden, almost surreal twist, the man slowly removed his mask. Relief washed over me as I recognized the familiar face of my friend Fred. He grinned sheepishly and yelled, "April Fools!" My breath came out in a rush, a mix of relief and annoyance flooding through me. I laughed, shaking my head at how easily I'd been fooled. But then, as I calmed down, something he said made my blood run cold. "How did you manage to whisper in my ear from all the way outside?" I asked, still catching my breath. Fred's smile faded. He looked genuinely confused. "What are you talking about? I never whispered anything. I've been outside the whole time." The room seemed to close in around me as the realization hit. If Fred hadn't whispered, then who or what had? My instincts screamed at me that we weren't alone. I grabbed Fred's arm, my voice shaking as I told him to hide and call the cops. Fred's confusion quickly turned to fear as he saw the seriousness in my eyes. We ducked behind the kitchen counter as he dialed 911. Minutes later, we heard the sirens and the tension in my chest eased slightly. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. The police entered cautiously, weapons drawn as they searched the house. It wasn't long before they found him, a man with long black hair, rummaging through my belongings. He looked like he hadn't showered in weeks, his clothes torn and filthy. Clutched in his hand was a pistol, and around his waist, several pocket knives gleamed ominously. The officers subdued him quickly, but the look in his eyes as they dragged him past us was something I'll never forget. Cold, detached, like we were nothing more than obstacles in his way. Later, the police told us the man had escaped from a nearby prison a few days ago. He had broken into my house looking for something, but they couldn't say what. Fred and I were left standing in the wreckage of my home, shaken and silent. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, one thought kept circling in my mind. What would have happened if Fred hadn't shown up? The whispered words, the masked figure. Were they warnings? Or something far more sinister? The house feels different now, like the shadows are a little too dark, the silence a little too deep. And sometimes late at night, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear that whisper, echoing through the empty rooms.
"I'm coming for you."
Growing up, my brother and I had a pretty wild childhood. We'd spend most of our evenings outside playing with toy guns and pretending to be cops, chasing imaginary bad guys in our backyard. It was all innocent fun, the kind of games kids play to pass the time. But there's one night I'll never forget. A night that took all that innocence and twisted it into something dark and unforgettable. It was around 10 p.m., and the three of us, my brother, his friend, and I, were out in the backyard, flashlights in hand, playing another round of cops and robbers. The night was quiet, almost unnervingly so, with only the distant hum of the city in the background. We were laughing, running around, when suddenly we saw him. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, just a shadow, a figment of my imagination. But as my flashlight beam landed on him, my breath caught in my throat. There he was, standing just a few feet away from us, a tall, thin man, his skin almost ghostly in the dim light. He didn't belong there. He didn't belong anywhere. "Hey, can I play with you?" he asked, his voice as unsettling as his appearance. My brother, ever the brave one, stammered out a nervous, "Sure." But something was wrong, so terribly wrong. The man's smile stretched too wide, his eyes too dark. And then he did something I can never forget. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a shard of glass, and began eating it. I was frozen, unable to move as the man chewed the glass, blood trickling down his chin. His eyes locked onto mine, and that smile, it was like he was enjoying it, like the pain was just a game to him. My brother's friend, who had been watching in stunned silence, suddenly bolted, jumping over the fence and disappearing into the night. My brother grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my horrified trance. "Run!" he yelled, dragging me back towards the house. But as we turned, I heard it, a crunch, followed by a sickening sound, like bones breaking under pressure. I glanced back and saw the man, now on his knees, still chewing, still smiling. We ran inside, slamming the door behind us. My brother grabbed the phone, trying to call our parents, but his hands were shaking too much to dial. And then we heard it, the loud crash of glass breaking. We both turned to see the front window shattered, a trail of blood leading into the house. Panic surged through me. "Upstairs!" my brother yelled, and we bolted up the stairs, hearts pounding. We hid in the bedroom, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but I could hear him, the soft shuffle of his footsteps, the crunching sound as he continued to eat the glass. Then the door creaked open, and he was there, standing in the doorway. But before he could take another step, my brother did something I didn't expect. He lunged at the man, punching him square in the face. The man stumbled back, more surprised than hurt, and that was all the time we needed. We bolted past him, down the stairs, and out the door. We ran to the nearest house, banging on the door until someone let us in. The police arrived not long after, and we told them everything. They found the man in our house, bleeding heavily from the mouth, shards of glass embedded in his gums and throat. He was barely alive, but he didn't seem to care. They said he'd escaped from a mental institution a few days earlier and had been wandering the neighborhood ever since. That night changed something in me. The games we used to play didn't seem fun anymore. The backyard, once a place of laughter and imagination, now felt tainted, like the darkness itself was watching, waiting for something to happen. And the man, the glass eater, he still haunts my dreams, his smile forever etched in my memory. It was the summer of 2015, and my family decided to take a trip from Texas to California to visit my aunt. I was only 11 years old at the time, and we were staying at my aunt's two-story house, a place that always made me a little uneasy. There was something about the tall ceilings, the narrow staircase, and the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. But I never imagined how that house would forever change the way I felt about being alone. One night, my parents went out to a party, leaving my brothers, my cousin, and me at home. My brothers, 2 years older than me, decided to go to the store with my cousin, who was old enough to drive. I, on the other hand, chose to stay behind. I wasn't in the mood for a trip to the store and figured I'd just play on my iPad until they got back. It was barely 6 p.m., still light out, and I didn't think twice about being alone in that big creaky house. 15 minutes after they left, I was sitting on the couch, lost in a game, when I heard it. A faint noise from upstairs, like something had been knocked over. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing, just the house settling or the wind. But then, a glass cup suddenly tumbled down the stairs, shattering at the bottom. I jumped up, my heart racing. I couldn't understand how it happened. The cup had been on the kitchen counter earlier. How could it have fallen down the stairs? Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept towards the stairs, peeking up, half expecting to see one of my brothers playing a prank. But the staircase was empty, just an eerie silence that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step back, deciding it was better to hide than to investigate further. I dashed into my uncle's room and hid inside the closet, crouching in the dark, my pulse pounding in my ears. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Then the lights in the room started flickering, casting strange, distorted shadows through the crack under the door. I held my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the fear was making it hard to keep still. Just as I was about to muster the courage to make a run for it, I heard another sound, this time the distinct creaking of floorboards above me. Something was definitely upstairs, and whatever it wasn't one of my brothers. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of the closet and ran out the front door, not stopping until I was in the driveway. My hands were trembling as I looked up at the house, trying to see if there was anyone or anything at the window. And that's when I saw her. She was standing in the upstairs window, staring down at me. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, framed by long, dark hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. But it was her eyes that sent a wave of terror through me. Deep, black pits. Like holes that went on forever. She wore a black dress that looked tattered, and for a moment I thought she might have been a nun, but something about her was all wrong. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as I locked eyes with her. It felt like she was staring right into my soul, reading every fear, every thought. And then, just as quickly as she appeared, I heard a car pulling into the driveway. My cousin and my brothers had returned. I rushed to meet them, trying to act normal, but my hands were shaking too much to hide my fear. "I just wanted to get some fresh air," I lied, hoping they wouldn't notice the terror in my voice. They didn't seem to suspect anything, and we all went back inside. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that maybe I was seeing things. But as we went upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, watching us. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't sleep. I kept expecting to see her again, to feel those black eyes on me. And then, around 10 p.m., I made the mistake of looking out the window during a flash of lightning. She was there, standing in the neighbor's yard, staring right at our house. I never told my brothers or cousin what I saw that night. But sometimes when I'm alone, I still see her in my mind, those black, hollow eyes staring at me, as if she's still out there waiting for me to be alone again. It was the winter of my 13th year when my family decided to take a break from the city and rent a cottage in a small village nestled in the mountains. The place was remote, surrounded by thick forest and a large icy lake that reflected the gray winter sky. The village itself was tiny, with only a handful of houses scattered around, their lights dim and distant. The whole scene felt like something out of a painting, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. Next to the cottage, there was an old, weather-beaten shed, its wooden walls covered in ivy and its roof patched together haphazardly. The door hung slightly ajar, swaying in the wind, and from the moment I saw it, I felt a strange pull, like it was daring me to come closer. My older brother, who was 16 at the time, was just as curious. So one afternoon, with nothing better to do, we decided to explore it. It was getting dark earlier than usual, the winter sun barely visible behind the mountains. We made our way through the snow-covered yard, our breath visible in the cold air. As we approached the shed, I noticed something odd. A faint light was shining through the cracks in the wooden walls. It wasn't a steady light, like a bulb, but more like a flickering torch, moving around inside. We stopped in our tracks, exchanging nervous glances. "Do you see that?" I whispered, half hoping my brother would dismiss it as nothing. But he didn't. His face had gone pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the shed. "I see it." We stood there, frozen in the snow, watching as the light moved slowly around the inside of the shed. Then, without warning, it stopped. The beam of light shot out through one of the cracks, blinding us momentarily. When our vision cleared, we saw the silhouette of a figure standing in the doorway, backlit by the flickering light. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I could feel my brother tense beside me. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, I could make out more details. It was a man, middle-aged, with long, greasy hair that clung to his face. His clothes were tattered, stained with something dark that I didn't want to think about. But it was his hands that terrified me the most. They were covered in what looked like fresh blood, dripping onto the snow as he moved. "Come here, kids," he called out, his voice raspy and low. "I've got something fun for you in here." I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My brother grabbed my arm, his grip tight and urgent. "Run!" he hissed, and without another word, we turned and bolted back towards the cottage. The snow was thick, slowing us down, but fear pushed us forward. I could hear the man's footsteps behind us, heavy and uneven, crunching through the snow. He was getting closer. My lungs burned from the cold air, and my legs felt like they were moving through molasses, but I kept running, fueled by sheer terror. We reached the cottage and slammed the door behind us, locking it quickly. My brother and I were both panting, trying to catch our breath as we pressed our ears to the door, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of our own frantic breathing. But then, we heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, followed by a low, wet chuckle. We backed away from the door, our eyes wide with fear. The sound moved around the cottage, stopping at each window as if the man was searching for a way in. And then suddenly, it stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you, making your skin crawl. We waited, every muscle in our bodies tense, but there was nothing. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, we dared to peek out the window, but all we saw was the empty yard, the shed standing in the distance, dark and still. When our parents returned later that evening, we told them everything. At first, they didn't believe us. They thought we were just playing one of our usual pranks. But then they saw the footprints in the snow, leading from the shed to the cottage and the bloodstains on the porch. They called the police, who arrived quickly given the village's small size. The police searched the shed and the surrounding area, but they didn't find the man. They did, however, find something far worse. Several blood-stained rags, a rusty knife, and the bones of small animals scattered across the shed's dirt floor. The police said the man had likely been living there for weeks, maybe longer. We left the cottage the next day, cutting our trip short. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, somewhere in those mountains, waiting for another family to come too close to his shed. It was supposed to be a night of fun and freedom, just my girlfriend and me out on the town with no particular place to go. We'd been dating for a while and things were getting serious, so we decided to make the most of a warm summer night by driving around, listening to music, and just enjoying each other's company. It was late, close to 1 a.m., when we pulled into an empty parking lot to take a break and relax. The lot was deserted, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. It was the kind of place where people go to be alone, to get away from the world for a little while. We parked the car, reclined our seats, and started talking, laughing, and eventually letting the conversation fade into something more intimate. Everything was perfect until I accidentally honked the horn with my elbow. The sound shattered the silence of the night, loud and jarring. I sat up quickly, a little embarrassed, and joked, "I hope that didn't draw any attention." My girlfriend just smiled and said, "It's late. Who would be around at this hour?" But as soon as she said that, I glanced out the window and my heart stopped. There, just a few feet away from the car, was a man, crouched down on his knees, watching us. He was close enough that I could see the whites of his eyes even in the dim light. For a second, I thought I was imagining things, but the longer I stared, the more real he became. His face was blank, emotionless, and he didn't move, just sat there staring at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I noticed something else. His hands. They were covered in blood. I don't know if it was his or someone else's, but the sight of it sent a cold shiver down my spine. Panic set in, and I quickly scrambled off my girlfriend and into the passenger seat, yelling at her to lock the doors. She fumbled with the controls, her hands shaking, and as she finally hit the lock button, the man stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. He raised his hands, palms out, as if to show he meant no harm, but the blood dripping from them told a different story. "Don't panic," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. But there was something about the way he said it that only made my fear spike even more. I yelled at my girlfriend to drive, and she did, slamming the car into gear and peeling out of the parking lot. As we sped away, I looked back and saw the man still standing there watching us, his expression unchanged. But as we rounded the corner, his face twisted into something darker, more sinister, a look of pure rage. We drove for a few blocks, our hearts racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Part of me wanted to keep going, to get as far away as possible, but another part of me couldn't let it go. What if he was hurt? What if someone else was in danger because we didn't do anything? Against my better judgment, I convinced my girlfriend to turn back. As we approached the parking lot, 2 police cars zoomed past us, lights flashing, sirens blaring. We followed them, our anxiety mounting, only to find the lot empty when we arrived. The man was gone, as if he had never been there at all. The police searched the area, questioning us about what we saw, but there wasn't much we could tell them. They mentioned that there had been reports of a violent altercation nearby earlier that night, but they didn't know if the man we saw was involved. We gave our statements and left, shaken and confused. Even now, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I do know that I'll never forget the look in his eyes as he watched us drive away. It was the look of someone who had lost everything and didn't care what happened next. Someone who might be out there still, waiting for another car to pull into that lot, another couple to get too comfortable. Since that night, I always make sure my car doors are locked, and I carry a taser with me wherever I go, because you never know who might be watching, waiting for their chance to make you their next victim.